is Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. In Japan, chilling tales are supposed to cool people down in the heat of the summer. The time for ghost stories culminates before fall even begins with the Obon Festival, August 15th in most of Japan. Obon is a festival that fuses Buddhism and Japanese folk beliefs in a unique way to honor the dead. But October marks spooky season in much of the world. Halloween at the end of the month has evolved into a celebration of the macabre that falls before the celebration of All Saints' Day at the beginning of November. All Saints' Day is when Christians honor the souls of the holiest of the holy. It's followed by All Souls' Day on November 2nd, when Christians pray for everyone else. Because it's spooky season in much of the world, today we're talking about one of Japan's most famous ghost stories, Boton Doro, better known as the tale of the Peony Lantern. And we're talking about the tale's most famous teller. As folklorist Zach Davison observes, when talking about Japanese ghosts, all roads eventually lead to Lafcadio Hearn. In some ways, Hearn is the first non-Japanese author Read Japanese Literature has taken up as the focus author of an entire episode. But Hearn has become such a part of Japanese culture, many Japanese people don't realize he was an immigrant to their country. It certainly helps that he is almost always published in Japan under his Japanese name, Yakumo Koizumi. And so in this episode, we'll explore the enduring legacy of Greek/English/Irish/American/Japanese author Patrick Lafcadio Hearn. We'll discuss the long history of the tale of the Peony Lantern, and we'll finish with a look at two modern adaptations of the story, one by Aoko Matsuda and another by Kyoko Nakajima. A brief content warning and a spoiler alert: we will be discussing A Peony Lantern in all of its glory, including the ending. The main thrust of the story is sex with a ghost and/or a dead person, although virtually none of the versions of the story include any graphic detail, and there will be no graphic detail in this episode. We'll also be discussing what may have seemed like progressive attitudes about race to some people in the late 19th century that are clearly problematic in 2025. For this section of the episode, I'm relying heavily on Steve Kem's biography, The Outsider: The Life and Work of Lafcadio Hearn. It's a readable account and draws from many earlier Hearn biographies. I will note that Kem is willing to be critical of Hearn, but he seems to take Hearn's stories about himself at face value, especially when there aren't other accounts available. Lafcadio Hearn's parents met on the island of Kythera, the most remote of the 7 Greek islands in the Ionian Sea. The British had controlled the island since 1815. Hearn's father was an Anglo-Irish officer-surgeon in the British Army named Charles Bush Hearn. Charles Bush Hearn was stationed on Kythera, then called Serigo, in 1848. Hearn's mother was a Greek woman Charles met on the island. Her name was Rosa Antonio Casimati. It was not necessarily a match made in heaven. The pair could barely speak a common language. Despite what you may have gathered from the film Love Actually, that's not a great foundation for most relationships. Rosa's family also didn't want her associating with a foreigner. Perhaps inevitably, Charles got Rosa pregnant anyway. Family lore says that Casimati's brother stabbed Charles Bush in retaliation, and Casimati hid him in a barn for his own protection. Charles was transferred away from the island of Kythera. Leaving her family behind, Rosa went with him to the island of Lafcadia. That's where she gave birth to their first son, George Robert, in 1849. By the time the pair married against Rosa's family wishes that fall, she was already 5 months pregnant with their second son, Patrick Lafcadio. In 1850, Charles traveled to England to claim a promotion. To go back to England and accept that promotion, he left his family on Lefkas. Rosa was alone when Patrick Lafcadio, later just Lafcadio, was born on June 27, 1850, and she was alone 2 months later when the couple's firstborn son, George Robert, died. Eventually, Charles called Rosa and Lafcadio to Dublin. I'm going to use Lafcadio from now on for clarity. He was Patrick until he moved to the U.S. at the age of 19 and got to choose what he wanted to be called for himself. By the time Rosa and Lafcadio arrived in Dublin, Charles wasn't even there. He met his son for the first time more than a year after Rosa and Lafcadio arrived in the fall of 1853. Both Rosa and Lafcadio were deeply out of place in Dublin. 2-year-old Lafcadio arrived with shoulder-length hair and 2 gold earrings. Rosa was so unhappy in rainy, dreary Ireland, where she barely spoke the language, that she became deeply depressed. She had a mental breakdown after realizing Charles no longer loved her. When Charles left for Crimea in 1854, she was pregnant again with their third son, Daniel James Hearn, but the couple never saw each other again. Charles had the marriage annulled without consulting Rosa. Both eventually remarried and both gave up their legal rights to both of their children. Neither lived happily ever after, but that's a little outside the scope of this episode. I don't have time to go into the rest of Hearn's childhood. I've told you all of this backstory because it introduces some of the, let's call them motifs, of Hearn's life. Hearn's position as an outsider, his discomfort with Anglo-American culture, his sympathy for people like his mother who were marginalized, and maybe even his uncomfortable fascination with exotic women. Hope you can hear the air quotes. Learning about Hearn's sexual preferences was not the best part of prepping for this episode. As he grew, Hearn also began to think all of his negative traits came from his father and all of his positive traits came from his mother and from being half Greek. He once wrote, "Whatever there is good in me came from that dark race soul of which we know so little. My love of right, my hate of wrong, my admiration for what is beautiful or true, my capacity for faith in man or woman, my sensitiveness to artistic things, which gives me whatever little success I have, even that language power whose physical sign is in both my brother and I, came from her." I want to add just one more incident from Hearn's childhood. At 16, Hearn suffered an eye injury that plagued him for the rest of his life. On the playground at school, a knotted rope from a game slipped from one of his classmates' hands and struck Hearn's left eye, blinding him on one side. Several operations failed to save Hearn's sight in that eye. Not long after, white scar tissue formed over the cornea. Hearn spent a lot of time reading and writing, so he quickly strained his right eye and it started to bug out. He was sensitive about the way his eyes looked until the day he died. In fact, he only had photographs taken from the right profile, and he wasn't particularly happy about the way they looked. As a young adult, just 19 years old, it was clear that the long-standing plan for Hearn to inherit his aunt's estate wasn't going to work out. Instead, Hearn was bundled onto an immigrant steamship bound for New York City. He arrived on September 2nd, 1869. Like so many 19th century Europeans before him and after him, he came looking for a new life. Also like many 19th century Europeans, Hearn found life in the New World much more difficult than he had anticipated. He hated the hustle and bustle of New York City and quickly made his way further west to Cincinnati. Hearn spent his early months in Cincinnati living rough, sleeping on the streets. A few months later, he caught the eye of a Scottish printer named Henry Watkin, who taught him the basics of typesetting, offered him 3 meals a day and a space on the typesetting office's floor, and essentially changed Hearn's life. Hearn got these benefits in exchange for becoming a kind of man of all work. With Watkin's support, by 1870, Hearn was writing articles for the Boston Independent. By the summer of 1872, Hearn was working as an assistant editor/handyman for the Cincinnati Trade List. And by the end of 1872, just 3 years after immigrating, just 3 years after living rough on the streets, Hearn finally had a job he truly wanted. He was a general assignment reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer. By 1874, he was one of the Enquirer's full-time staff reporters and specialized in feature stories for the Sunday edition. When he started that job, he was paid $10 American a week, the equivalent of a little more than $280 a week in the fall of 2025, and for that wage, he worked 14 to 16-hour days. He was so valued by the paper, though, that within the year, his salary had more than doubled to $25 a week, or about $710–$25 a week. As a reporter, Hearn loved to expose charlatans and spiritual hypocrites. He wrote several grim stories about murders. He also liked to write stories about marginalized people. In many stories, he essentially worked as a folklorist, a generation before that was a recognized scholarly field. For example, he recorded the music of Cincinnati's black subculture, making sure the lyrics and music were annotated and preserved just as carefully as classical and popular music. Now, I need to take up a more problematic aspect of Hearn's biography. Hearn was inarguably progressive for his day, befriending people of color and making sure their stories were told. He was a Republican when the Republicans were the party of Abraham Lincoln, the party that had supported abolition and was more supportive of civil rights. He was willing to clash with the editors of the Democratic Cincinnati Enquirer over what he believed to be right. But he also had a fetish for women of color. And this isn't me in 2025 reading backward into history. It's a fetish he owned pretty openly. He wrote to a friend that he preferred to visit women in brothels using some pretty unenlightened language. Quote, "After all, so long as all women have to be bought, one might as well buy 'em when he wants 'em." And when describing his taste in the women he visited at brothels to a friend, Hearn noted, quote, "I eat and drink and sleep with members of the races you detest like the son of Odin that you are." Later, he described the beauty of a Creole woman on the remote Grand Isle as, quote, "a beauty that existed in the tertiary epoch, 300,000 years ago, the beauty of the most ancient branch of humanity, the oldest of the world's races." He went on that he would like to stand on the Grand Isle and realize Alfred Lord Tennyson's wish, quoting the Tennyson poem Locksley Hall. Quote, "I will wed some savage woman, she shall rear my dusky race." Hearn's first marriage is probably the best example of this contradiction, an action that was progressive but ultimately problematic. Hearn married Althea Mattie Foley, whom Kem describes as, quote, "a beautiful light-skinned African-American," and he married her in 1874. A mutual liking between Hearn and Foley, who was a cook, bloomed into friendship. Notably, Foley even featured in one of Hearn's first ever stories about ghosts. He relays her words, quote, "People call me a medium sometimes. I tell you the truth, sir, when I say that far from refusing to leave the dead alone, I would be only too happy if they would leave me alone." Hearn eventually decided he wanted to marry Foley. It took some time, but he convinced her to agree. Now, any marriage between a black person and a white person would have been highly controversial and extremely illegal. If the two had lived any further south or their genders had been reversed, it might well have gotten them killed. Ultimately, the marriage only lasted 7 months before the pair separated. The illegal and taboo marriage weighed on both of them. According to Kim, Hearn was temperamental, taciturn, and irritable. Foley was capricious and irresponsible. Kim's biography notes that Hearn tried to help Foley as much as he could after they separated. I'll add my own observation that Hearn offered Foley $5 a week, saving for himself twice what he had earned less than a year before. The pair never actually divorced. They didn't have to. The state would never have considered the union legal at all. The longer they spent separated, the less Hearn seems to have worried about her. Foley legally married a black man in 1880, but there's no evidence Hearn ever found out. In the end, the powers that be in Cincinnati pressured the Enquirer to discard its Republican ace reporter. Hearn's marriage to Foley was an excellent excuse. Hearn was quickly hired at a lower wage by the Enquirer's chief rival, the Cincinnati Commercial. But by 1877, Hearn decided there was nothing interesting left to write about in Cincinnati. He wanted to go to New Orleans. And since the wife of a prominent businessman was relentlessly pursuing an affair he didn't want to participate in, he decided it was time to go. Hearn struggled during his early years in New Orleans, although never as much as his first months in Cincinnati. He didn't really find his feet in his new city until the end of 1881. That's when two of the city's most important papers merged to become the New Orleans Times-Democrat. And this new paper hired Hearn as their literary editor, paying him $30 a week, today's $950. It doesn't speak entirely well about Hearn that he kept his progressive views about race to himself once he had transplanted himself to New Orleans. He'd faced consequences for standing up for what was right in Cincinnati. He didn't want to do it again. He was also constantly on edge that news about his marriage to Maddie would reach the Deep South. "You cannot imagine how utterly the news of that time would ruin me here," he wrote to a friend. Instead, Hearn took up other reform issues like police brutality, public health, and political graft. He did continue his work as a folklorist, this time of the Louisiana Creole language, culture, music, and even food. You might be surprised to learn that Lafcadio Hearn was the one who compiled the world's first Louisiana Creole cookbook. After 10 years in New Orleans, Hearn again decided it was time to move on. He spent 2 years in Martinique before convincing the editors at Harper's Magazine to fund a journalistic trip to Japan in late 1889. Hearn's professional relationship with Harper's didn't continue very long after he arrived. Hearn was quick to take offense, notoriously short-tempered, and extremely reactionary. In his letter of resignation at Harper's, he wrote, "Please understand that your resentment for me has less than the value of a bottled fart, and your bank account less consequence than a wooden shithouse struck by lightning." It took some time after that to rebuild relationships in the American publishing world. His work finally appeared again in The Atlantic in 1891. After that, though, Hearn began building what Kim describes as a reputation as a compelling and perceptive interpreter of Japan for the English-speaking world. In the meantime, Hearn continued to write, but to pay the bills, he took on work as a high school English teacher and eventually a professor at one of Japan's most important universities. Hearn loved Japan. For the first time in his life, this self-conscious man's appearance didn't stand out as odd. His height, just 5'3", 160 centimeters, was average for the man on the street. Most of the Japanese he encountered outside of Tokyo had never seen a foreigner before and assumed he was supposed to look the way he did. At the suggestion of a professional associate, Hearn married Setsu Koizumi in 1891. Hearn was 40, Setsu was 22. She was the daughter of a former samurai family. Like virtually all samurai, the entire family had lost their status at the end of the Edo period and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration. By marrying her, Hearn took on the responsibility of caring for her parents and grandparents. By all accounts, the marriage between Hearn and Setsu Koizumi was a happy one. It did take some time for Setsu to adjust. In her memoir, she noted, "Hearn had a peculiar temperament, and it caused me much trouble." It wasn't long into his stay in Japan that Hearn began to collect Japanese folk tales, because that was just the kind of thing that Hearn did. But he quickly realized that Japanese culture was modernizing just as rapidly as American culture, and that modernization was displacing traditional Japanese culture every bit as much as modernization was displacing Black subculture in Cincinnati and Creole culture in New Orleans. And Japanese culture was every bit as much worth preserving. Setsu became an important source for Hearn, telling him Japanese tales in a sort of English-Japanese hybrid language the two cobbled together so they could communicate with one another. And Hearn settled down as a faithful, devoted husband. Their family was a good bit less settled, mostly for professional reasons related to Hearn's career. The Hearn family lived in 5 different cities in the course of 14 years. The couple had 4 children. Leopold Kazuo, Iwao, and Kiyoshi were their sons, and they had a daughter, Setsuka. By 1896, Hearn realized that the only way to protect his family in case he died was to become a Japanese citizen. Only Japanese citizens could pass their property on to their families. And so he did, becoming Yakumo Koizumi. Hearn had begun to worry about his family a lot. He began to write like he was running out of time. He wanted the royalties from his books to produce income if something happened to him. He wrote his most famous books in the last decade of his life. They include In Ghostly Japan, the book that's most relevant for us today because it includes Hearn's version of the Peony Lantern. In 1904, he finished Kaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things. Hearn spelled the word Kwaidan, by the way, with the W. It's pronounced Kaidan. It means ghost stories, and today it has a decidedly old-fashioned ring. We'll come back to Kaidan in the next section of the episode. Hearn told his wife, "I know my own body well. It will be hard for me to see Kazuo enter middle school." And Hearn was right. He did know his own body. On September 26th, 1904, he told Setsu he'd had a dream where he traveled a long distance to an unfamiliar place. That evening, he lay down because he felt unwell. A few minutes later, he was dead. His wife later recalled he died without any pain, having a little smile around his mouth. It could not be helped if it was the order of heaven. There are many things about Hearn's life that are problematic, and he was certainly cantankerous and difficult to get along with. But Hearn deserves to be remembered, too, as a journalist writing with an insight that was far ahead of his time. As he wrote in a letter to a friend, "What is wanted, what will succeed, what will endure, are reflections of real life, expressions of present existence, artistic and faithful records of what we hear, see, and feel through the impressions made upon us by those social forces of which we form inferences. Realism, if you please to call it such, but realism need not be dry, colorless, and commonplace. Deftly utilized, it never is. Lafcadio Hearn's version of the Peony Lantern is titled A Passional Karma. I'm going to abridge it for you. Before I begin, let me clarify that a peony lantern is not a normal lantern with a little peony painted on the side. It's a special lantern used just for Obon with a papier-mâché or papier-mâché peony set on the top. These lanterns are no longer in use. There once lived a Hatamoto whose only daughter, Tsuyu, was beautiful as her name. According to Hearn, the Hatamoto were samurai forming the special military force of the shogun. The name literally signifies banner supporters. These were the highest class of samurai, not only as the immediate vassals of the shogun, but as a military aristocracy. Old Tsuyu lived happily enough until one day when the family physician, Shijo Yamamoto, paid her a visit in company with a young samurai named Shinzaburo Hajiwara. Shinzaburo was an unusually handsome lad and very gentle. The two young people fell in love with each other at first sight. At parting, Otsuyu whispered to the youth, "Remember, if you do not come back to see me again, I shall certainly die." Etiquette forbade Shinzaburo to make a visit alone. He was obliged to wait for some other chance to accompany the doctor. Unfortunately, the doctor perceived the sudden affection of Otsuyu, and he feared that her father would hold him responsible for any serious results. Otsuyu's father had a reputation for cutting off heads. Months passed, and Otsuyu, little imagining the true cause of Shinzaburo's neglect, believed that her love had been scorned. Then she pined away and died. Soon afterwards, the faithful servant Oyone also died, through grief at the loss of her mistress. Shinzaburo knew nothing of what had happened, but his disappointment and his anxiety had resulted in a prolonged illness. He was slowly recovering, but still very weak, when he unexpectedly received another visit from Shijo Yamamoto. "I am very sorry to tell you that the young lady is dead," Yamamoto said to Shinzaburo. Shinzaburo inscribed Otsuyu's name upon a mortuary tablet and placed the tablet in the Buddhist shrine of the house. Every day thereafter, he presented offerings and repeated the Nembutsu. You might recall the Nembutsu from earlier episodes. It's a Pure Land Buddhist prayer to Amida Buddha, Namu Amida Butsu, a prayer for the dead. Nothing occurred to change the monotony of Shinzaburo's solitude before the time of Obon, the great festival of the dead. Everything was quiet. But all at once the stillness was broken by the sound of women's geta, wooden platform sandals, approaching. Karakon, karakon. And the sound drew nearer and nearer, quickly, till it reached the live hedge surrounding the garden. Then Shinzaburo, feeling curious, stood on tiptoe, so as to look over the hedge, and he saw two women passing. One, who was carrying a beautiful lantern decorated with peony flowers, appeared to be a servant. The other was a slender girl of about 17, wearing a long-sleeved robe embroidered with designs of autumn blossoms. Almost at the same instant, both women turned their faces towards Shinzaburo, and to his utter astonishment, he recognized Otsuyu and her servant Oyone. The Japanese language is famous for its evocative onomatopoeia, words that represent sounds. Karakon, or sometimes karan-koron, is famously associated with the peony lantern. It is the sound of Otsuyu's first ghostly appearance on the stage or on the page. Shinzaburo immediately explains that he thought Otsuyu was dead and invites the pair into his home. The maid explains that they thought he was dead. The couple reunites and Shinzaburo invites them to stay the night. The two women remained that night in the house of the young samurai and returned to their home a little before daybreak. After that night, they came every night for 7 nights, whether the weather were foul or fair, always at the same hour. And Shinzaburo became more and more attached to the girl. One night, at a very late hour, Shinzaburo's servant heard the voice of a woman in his master's apartment, and this made him uneasy. He therefore resolved to watch, and on the following night he stole on tiptoe to Shinzaburo's dwelling and looked through a chink in one of the sliding shutters. By the glow of a night lantern within the sleeping room, he was able to perceive that his master and a strange woman were talking together under the mosquito net. At first he could not see the woman distinctly. Then he determined at all hazards to get one glimpse of her face. And at last he was able to see, for the face was the face of a woman long dead, and the fingers caressing were fingers of naked bone, and of the body below the waist there was not anything. It melted off into the thinnest trailing shadow. The servant flees to a nin somi next door. A nin somi is able to tell people's fortunes by looking at their faces. The nin somi tells the servant, "If the woman be a ghost, your master must die very soon, unless something extraordinary can be done to save him. I shall do all that I can to save Hajiwara-sama." The next day, the nin somi tells Shinzaburo that his lover is dead and convinces Shinzaburo to visit the site she told him she now lives. Suddenly his attention was attracted by 2 new tombs placed side by side at the rear of the temple. One was a common tomb, such as might have been erected for a person of humble rank. The other was a large and handsome monument, and hanging before it was a beautiful peony lantern, which had probably been left there at the time of the Festival of the Dead. Shinzaburo is understandably terrified. The nin somi directs him to the high priest Ryoseki. Ryoseki explains to Shinzaburo, "The dead person has no desire to injure you out of hate, feels no enmity towards you. She is influenced, on the contrary, by the most passionate affection for you. Probably the girl has been in love with you from a long time preceding your present life, from a time of not less than 3 or 4 past existences." He gives Shinzaburo a Buddhist amulet and some sutras to protect him. Shinzaburo follows Ryosuke's instructions to the letter until the dead of night, when he hears karankuron, karankuron. Seeing the sutras posted outside of Shinzaburo's house, Yone notes that they can't enter. Night after night the shadows came, and nightly Shinzaburo heard the weeping of Otsuyu, yet he believed himself saved, little imagining that his doom had already been decided by the characters of his servants. The servant breaks his promise to keep the supernatural visits a secret. His wife talks him into accepting a bribe from the 2 ghosts. If they have enough money, it doesn't matter to her if Shinzaburo lives or dies. And the women agree to pay. Another day went, and another night came, and the dead came with it. But this time no lamentation was heard without the house of Hajiwara, for the faithless servant found his reward and removed the sutras. Moreover, he had been able, while his master was at the bath, to steal from its case the amulet and to substitute for it an image of copper. So the visitants found nothing to oppose their entering. Veiling their faces with their sleeves, they rose and passed, like a streaming of vapor, into the little window from over which the holy text had been torn away. But what happened thereafter within the house, the servant never knew. The sun was high before he ventured again to approach his master's dwelling and to knock upon the sliding doors. For the first time in years he obtained no response, and the silence made him afraid. He rolled back the rumbling shutters to admit the light, but still within the house there was no stir. At last he dared to lift a corner of the mosquito net, but no sooner had he looked beneath than he fled from the house with a cry of horror. Shinzaburo was dead, hideously dead, and his face was the face of a man who had died in the uttermost agony of fear. And lying beside him in the bed were the bones of a woman, and the bones of the arms and the bones of the hands clung fast about his neck. Lafcadio Hearn has captured here what are now the most well-known outlines of the story of the Peony Lantern. The Peony Lantern is one of Japan's most famous kaidan. It was one of the first kaidan ever filmed, beginning with a silent version in 1910. It was filmed 6 more times between 1911 and 1937, although all 7 of the early versions are lost. And the Peony Lantern was even the first kaidan adapted into a porno. I briefly defined kaidan a few minutes ago, but I'd like to go into a little bit more depth. I'm going to review some ground we covered a long time ago, way back in the Season 1 episode, Kaidan, Japan's Ghost Stories. In Edo, Japan, a group of friends would collect as night fell. In one room, the friends would light 100 paper and bamboo lamps and place a lone mirror on a small table. When the sky was dark, the guests would take turns telling scary stories of supernatural encounters, and after each story was over, the teller would extinguish one of the lanterns, look in the mirror, and return to their friends. By the 100th tale, they had supposedly created a safe haven for the spirits. Many games stopped at the 99th tale. This game was known as Hyaku Monogatari Kaidanki, or the Gathering of 100 Supernatural Tales, and it's the origin of the term kaidan, or ghost stories. Hyaku Monogatari Kaidanki was a part of the general cultural trend that Japanese folklorist Zach Davison calls a renaissance of the weird. Around the same time, new technologies made the written, printed, word more accessible than it had ever been before. People wanted to buy collections of stories they could show off during gatherings of 100 tales, books full of kaidan. To meet new demand for printed books, publishers turned to Japanese translations of Chinese material, including Chinese ghost stories. And that's how the Peony Lantern came into Japanese literary culture. Chu You published Jian Dong Xin Hua in 1378. The title literally translates as something like New Stories Told While Trimming the Wick, or New Stories After Snuffing the Lamp. The collection is itself an anthology of older stories from China and East Asia. In Chu's collection, most of the stories have a moral. Chu's version of the Peony Lantern includes a protagonist, a widowed scholar, who dies a terrible death because he has sex with the spirit of a dead girl he saw strolling past his house with a stone lantern. His neighbor had warned him, but he just couldn't resist. It's a nice Buddhist moral: accept impermanence and don't give in to worldly desires. In 1666, Japanese writer and Buddhist priest Asai Ryoi took the most interesting of the stories from Chu's collection and turned them into a less edifying collection called Otogi Boko, or hand puppets. Asai updated the stories so they take place in contemporary Japan, not China. And even though he was a priest, he took the morals out of these stories without a qualm. Hand puppets is clearly intended to satisfy the desire for new Hyaku Monogatari Kaidanki stories. In Ansai's version of the story, a widowed samurai sees a beautiful woman, now named Otsuyu, strolling past his home with a peony lantern. The two had never met before. The samurai vows to have an eternal relationship with her. He, like the Chinese scholar before him, fails to escape temptation even after the dire warnings from a neighbor. This protagonist almost avoids death. Romantically, maybe, he decides to die in his ghostly lover's arms rather than die pining for her. The Peony Lantern became an important source for theater. Rakugo is a sort of comic one-man storytelling. A lone rakugoka sits on his knees in traditional seiza style and uses only a paper fan and a tenugui, or a small towel, as props to tell a convoluted comic story with multiple characters. The Peony Lantern was adapted into a rakugo by Sanyute Encho in 1884. This version was called Kaidan Boton Doro. Rakugo can be a somewhat improvisational art form, so Kaidan Boton Doro varied with almost every telling. But it became the first ever oral performance in Japanese to be transcribed, and the transcribed version is considered the definitive one, and the Peony Lantern took on the shape we recognize today. The widower has become a charming young man. Otsuyu dies for love of Shinzaburo, whom she has previously met. And the Peony Lantern has now become both a ghost story and a love story. As Zach Davison observes, Meiji-era audiences, quote, had seen such things as Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and demanded a more romantic tone. They especially were moved when the love was tinged with sorrow. Incho also tacked on the totally original side story of Kosuke, son of a Hatamoto killed by a drunken samurai who later seeks revenge. Kaidan Boton Doro was adapted into a kabuki production in 1892. It was called by the same title. Kabuki is a much more elaborate form of dance drama performed entirely by men since the 17th century. The kabuki drama dropped that revenge narrative, but fleshed out the tale of the lovers into a full-length narrative. Kaidan Boton Doro was the basis of Lafcadio Hearn's version of the story. The Peony Lantern may be the most famous Japanese story about a dead lover, but it is by no means the only one. We covered Ueda Akinari's The Reed-Choked House from Tales of Moonlight and Rain in Read Japanese Literature Season 1 episode about Kaidan. And even Haruki Murakami dabbles with the motif in Kafka on the Shore. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Sigmund Freud hypothesized that eros and thanatos are the two main drivers of human behavior, sex and death. For readers of the Peony Lantern, there's no need to choose. The history of the Peony Lantern didn't end with kabuki theater and early film adaptations. It was made into a film at least as recently as 1996, and modern writers continue to draw inspiration from the tale. Aoko Matsuda adapted the Peony Lantern for one of the stories in her collection Where the Wild Ladies Are. Matsuda was born in 1979. She recently celebrated her 46th birthday. Polly Barton's English translation of Where the Wild Ladies Are debuted in 2020. Where the Wild Ladies Are adapts many classic Japanese kaidan and setsuwa, even older Buddhist moral fables. The stories are loosely connected by a male protagonist of sorts who encounters many of the ghosts. The frame narrative isn't that important. Personally, I think most of the stories work best as standalones. Matsuda's Peony Lantern is called, handily, Peony Lanterns. You can read the story for free on Electric Lit. Shinzaburo is now a married man rather than a widower or a single man. He's a former salesman who was laid off as part of the company's post-recession restructure. So this Shinzaburo's loss isn't in love, it's a professional loss. There he'd been, believing that he was talented and had something to offer to the world. He'd gone about his life not being a nuisance to anyone, playing by the rules, acting reasonably at all times. How had it come to this? But the story still takes place during Obon. His wife is away visiting family, and he gets a knock on the door at an inconvenient hour. When he peers through the peephole, he finds two women dressed in identical outfits. One woman is in her 40s and one is in her early 30s. "Oh, good evening, sir," the older woman says. "We are door-to-door sales representatives visiting the homes in this area in the best of faith. We are terribly sorry to disturb you at this hour, but we were wondering if you might be able to spare us a couple of minutes of your time." Somehow, and Shinzaburo isn't quite sure how, the three end up seated in his living room. And instead of the sales pitch Shinzaburo is expecting, the older woman launches into the younger woman's tragic life story. She claims that just being together sharing that story creates an indelible connection between the three of them. When the older woman concludes and hears Shinzaburo's reaction, she responds, "My, what a horrendous age we are living in. In days of yore, anyone who beheld my friend's great beauty and heard even a snippet of her tragic tale would be overwhelmed by sympathy and agree to commit lover's suicide with her on the spot." And then it turns out that all of this has indeed been leading up to a sales pitch after all. The women want to sell Shinzaburo a peony lantern. Of late, these portable lanterns are enjoying a surprising revival. You'll find they're far more fashionable than flashlights. Many customers like to coordinate them with the design of their yukata when attending summer festivals. And now that it's Obon, they're great for hanging outside the house to welcome home the souls of the returning dead. Matsuda's version of the story is wry and doesn't end with a clear resolution for the two women. But at least Shinzaburo escapes with his life. The whole thing is almost a statement that modern Japan is just too mundane to make space for the truly supernatural. In all honesty, I vastly prefer what Kyoko Nakajima does with the Peony Lantern in her version. Kyoko Nakajima was born in 1964. She's 15 years Matsuda's senior. She was a magazine editor for most of her professional life. She debuted as a fiction writer in 2003. She's probably best known for her 2010 novel, The Little House, translated into English by Jenny Topley Takamori. Nakajima won the Naoki Prize for The Little House. The Naoki Prize is the sister prize of the Akutagawa, except it's awarded to writers of popular fiction. The distinction sort of makes sense some of the time to readers outside of Japan. In this case, it's pretty opaque. Nakajima's work seems fairly literary to me. Anyway, Things Remember and Things Forgotten is a collection of Nakajima's published work that isn't available as a published collection in Japan. All of the stories were translated into English by either Jenny Topley Takamori or Ian MacDonald. The story we're discussing today, The Harajuku House, was translated by Takamori. The Harajuku House is less clearly inspired by the Peony Lantern than Peony Lanterns. The Shinzaburo-esque character has a different name. He's the one to first approach the Otsuyu character, who also has a different name, and there's no connection to Obon. Still, this is a romantic story about an unsettled ghost. It begins as a frame narrative. The first-person narrator wants to tell the reader about the ghost story that made the biggest impression on them. It's one they heard from an older factory manager from Kyushu who has come to Tokyo on business. W breaks into the drinking party of these old college buddies to add, "I don't really believe in ghosts and stuff, but it's possible I may actually have met one. I don't really like to call her that, though." The story inside of the frame takes place in the 1980s. W gets a job conducting a survey in the Harajuku district of Shibuya, Tokyo. Today, Harajuku is an internationally renowned center of youth culture and fashion. While doing his work, he encounters a bizarre half-Western, half-Japanese house, and its resident, a house sitter named Noriko. After a couple of visits, the two fall into bed together. When he attempts to visit again, though, she's gone. Another neighborhood resident attempts to warn him. "She's a ghost, you know." On another failed visit, the neighbor explains, "The girl was a distant relative of the wealthy man who lived in this house. Her father died fighting in the war, and she evacuated with her mother up north to Tohoku, where they both caught dysentery. But her soul could not rest, and she came back to this house where she'd often come to play as a child." The man's attraction to Noriko quickly descends into obsession. The more he interacts with Noriko, the more he begins to suspect the neighbor is right. After a forced 2-week absence, W returns to the site of the house to discover it has been torn down. No one was living in the house when it was torn down, he is informed. No one has lived in the house since the 1960s. This Shinzaburo figure too has escaped with his life, but without his love. Many of the stories in Things Remembered and Things Forgotten are about Japan's collective amnesia about World War II and its abiding failure to deal with its war legacy. In a 2014 interview with David Peace, Nakajima said, "Even 70 years after the end of the war, I still feel we have not completely come to terms with what happened." You can find a link to that entire interview on the episode page. Nakajima sprinkles the Harajuku house with reminders like, "This was long before anyone had even thought about pulling down Omotesando's iconic pre-war concrete apartment block and replacing it with a high-end shopping complex. There are constant reminders that the Harajuku house is both Eastern and Western, and Noriko's fate is tied to both pre-war Japan and to the post-war American occupation, both Japanese culture and American culture." The conclusion of the story actually calls into question whether the house itself is a ghost, whether Japanese places, too, can haunt the Japanese like lost lovers. So, why should we read the work of Lafcadio Hearn? Again, when talking about Japanese ghosts, all roads eventually lead to Lafcadio Hearn. He is one of the most influential writers on the subject of Japanese ghosts, both inside and outside of Japan. It's difficult to overstate Hearn's cultural impact. It's partially because of Hearn's work that some of Japan's most famous kaidan endure and continue to shape Japanese storytelling today, including the work of Aoko Matsuda and Kyoko Nakajima. Today we've looked at several versions of the Peony Lantern, including A Passional Karma by Lafcadio Hearn, Peony Lanterns by Aoko Matsuda, translated by Polly Barton, and The Harajuku House by Kyoko Nakajima, translated by Jenny Topley Takamori. Many of the versions of the Peony Lantern we discussed today are free to read online. You can find links on the episode page. North Americans can buy most books I mention on the podcast from Read Japanese Literature's Bookshop to support RJL. A special thank you to Patreon supporters. You can join them by visiting patreon.com/readjapaneseliterature. Stay tuned for our next episode, which takes up works of Japanese literature adapted into films. I think the episode will focus on Yasutaka Tsutsui and his novel Paprika, translated into English by Andrew Driver. The episode's still under development. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. Reach us through Patreon, through the website readjapaneseliterature.com, Blue Sky at readjapaneseliterature.com, Facebook through the link on the website, and YouTube /@readjapaneseliterature. Thank you to the Japanese literature communities on Blue Sky and Goodreads. Thank you to Zach Davison for reminding me about his book on Yurei, the Japanese ghost, specifically the chapter on the Peony Lantern. And thank you as always to producer Kime for today's music, kimemusic.com.